Welcome to Creepy McCreepface. It's story time. For the past few days, I've been hearing this intermittent buzzing sound. At first, I thought I'd become used to it and eventually stop hearing it entirely. But to me, it just became more obnoxious over time. It transformed into something akin to a constant vibrating noise in the back of my head. It was difficult to focus on anything. It became so bad that I had trouble sleeping. And it's beyond me how my parents never noticed it. But you know how the saying goes though, you lose hearing with age? So I wasn't surprised when they gave me a confused look. Tyler, my neighbour, however, he had heard it, and I was relieved at that. It meant I wasn't going crazy. He's actually the one that brought it up when we were in my bedroom playing video games. With him at my side, I became determined to find the source of this noise. We searched my house and placed their ears over all the walls. The buzzing sound never seemed to become stronger or weaker, so we went outside. My original thought was that something was wrong with the air conditioning unit. If I was right, it would explain why the sound transferred throughout the entire house. Needless to say, however, my theory was wrong. We stood beside the thrumming unit, watching the gigantic fan spin around inside. The unit was vibrating, but it wasn't the sound we were looking for. However, we did realise that the sound was louder outside than it had been in my room. So, searching my backyard up and down, we came to a stop at the wooden fence surrounding the yard. We placed our ears to the fence and exchanged a knowing stare. The sound was coming from beyond the fence, and that was enough for both of us. We climbed the fence and dropped easily to the other side. The area beyond my backyard was filled with untouched forest. I'd been over my fence a few times when I'd accidentally kicked a soccer ball over, but not often enough to really explore. My parents always complained about there being poison ivy everywhere, and there was. We skirted around it and created a path without a problem. It was really bizarre though. All we could hear was this buzzing sound. Nothing else. I mean, we could just barely hear the leaves and sticks crackling beneath our feet. But all other sounds seemed absent. There were no birds chirping, which was the weirdest part for me. You'd be hard-pressed to find an area of woods that there weren't birds constantly singing to each other. As we kept walking, the buzzing sound grew louder, and eventually we couldn't see my fence anymore. We stopped several yards from a cluster of trees covered in tumour-like growths. We just stood there, staring at it. Neither of us could explain what they were. They appeared like they were a part of the tree, as if the bark had bubbled outward in these strange formations. Trees can actually develop deformed growths called burls, something I learned in hindsight. Naturally though, our first thoughts were to poke it, but both of us were way too chicken to get any closer, so we grabbed rocks instead. It only took one toss. Tyler was a baseball player. The rock collided with one of the large growths, and upon contact the growth exploded outward, sending chunks flying. Not even seconds later, thousands of bees swarmed out of the opening and formed into a thick, throbbing mass. Both of us screamed and ran. I'd never run faster in my entire life. The bees were hot on our heels, and I could feel their stingers plunging into my arms, my back, my legs, anywhere they could swarm. I don't remember hopping the fence or how I arrived in my front yard, but I must have been screaming bloody murder. I stripped down to my underwear, and my mum began spraying me and the persistent bees with a garden hose. The icy, pressurised water didn't hurt as bad as the stings or the welts that formed instantly. I was ushered into the kitchen, given a towel, and my bum began meticulously removing the stingers with a pair of tweezers. She lost count of how many she removed from my body. I was only allowed to change into dry underwear since the stings needed to be iced. The swelling and the welts had been unimaginable, and now I understand how people can die from bee stings. I was forced onto the couch with ice packs positioned all over my body. The majority of the stings were on my back, so I laid on my stomach, and I must have passed out sometime later. I woke the next day in the same position. The ice packs had been removed. My mum refused to let me change into comfortable clothing until she inspected all the welts. Thankfully, the swelling had reduced significantly since the previous day. Over a bowl of soup, I learnt that my parents called an exterminator after the incident. Apparently, there had been bees angrily flying around our yard and some of the neighbours' yards. By that point, everyone in our street could hear the enraged buzzing. The exterminator arrived promptly and followed the trail of chaotic bees back to the nest. The man actually told my parents it had been the largest colony he'd ever seen. He sprayed so many chemicals that he didn't want anyone near the area. Not that anyone would want to investigate for themselves. The whole situation made me feel like a complete idiot. How could we have been so stupid? My only consolation was that Tyler might have suffered just as bad as me with the bee stings. I brought this up to my parents and asked how bad his injuries were. My mother gave me this petrified expression that I'll never forget. There had been nobody behind me when I raced around the side of the house. She hadn't even been aware that Tyler had gone back there with me. I felt guilty, beyond guilty. For the next few days, horrible images of Tyler being swarmed consumed me. I swore that he'd been right beside me. What made me feel worse is that the exterminator never saw anyone. If Tyler had fallen and been injured, the exterminator would have known because he had to search the entire area for nests and make sure everything was sprayed with pesticide. About a week after the incident, Tyler was still missing. I'd had enough. I decided to search the area for myself, but this time I wasn't going unprepared. I grabbed a can of my mother's hairspray, along with a small blue lighter from the kitchen. If any of these bees were still kicking, then I wanted protection, and perhaps some revenge. I hopped the fence and moved slowly through the forest, my right hand clenched tightly to the hairspray. The distance to the nest was much further than I'd remembered, but I knew that I'd arrive when I heard a thick crunch beneath my shoes. I glanced down and felt a shiver rush through my body. The entire ground was layered, covered with bee corpses. I couldn't see the dirt or the grass, and in some areas, the bees just piled on top of each other in massive clumps. I was really on my last nerve by now. Trying my best to ignore the sickening crunches underfoot, I approached the nests. I narrowed my eyes at the nest that we destroyed, and when I ran to the tree, the rest of the nest became apparent, nearly 10 times larger. I cautiously nudged one of these nests, which crumbled, revealing thick wax and honeycomb. Dead bees trapped inside of the nest oozed through the opening, and it was enough to turn my stomach. I grumbled beneath my breath and began poking the nest with more confidence, watching more of the pieces fall to the ground. That's when I heard the buzzing return. My heart, it skipped several beats, and I nearly stumbled backwards and landed in the disgusting ruin of dead bees. I sprinted back several feet and raised the hairspray and lighter, watching the nest from all angles. These bees could appear from anywhere. They must have formed their nest throughout the cluster of trees, and it was very possible that their nest extended into the ground, as well as beneath the roots. I bit my lip and waited for the swarm to appear like last time. But they never did. Instead, an odd, disturbing sight took me by surprise. Enough for me to lower my guard. I left the clearing filled with dead bees and stepped through several bushes, trying to confirm what I was seeing. Then my whole body quivered, and I wanted to call out. My voice failed me though, and it might have saved my life. Not even 10 yards from me was Tyler. He was just standing there with his back facing me, and something was wrong. His movements were off. His body was twitching involuntarily, and when he took a step, his posture was rigid, while his arms were locked into janky positions. Despite the horrible feeling in my gut, I wanted to call out to him. However, my concern quickly transformed into fear. Tyler slowly turned his head. Tyler slowly turned and lowered his head to the side as if his neck were broken. He knew I was here, yet he couldn't see me. His eyes were gone. 2 dark sockets stared back at me with bees crawling out of them. Sores lay at his flesh, which had turned into gaping holes, and a vicious fluid was running down his chin. I was too scared to move. I only ran when Tyler began lumbering towards me, swaying back and forth and twitching. For the second time I screamed and ran for the hills, trying to outrun the crashes coming from behind me. When I scrambled over the fence, I felt the wood scraping my skin, but I didn't care. I pounded on my back door crazily and slammed it shut once my mother left me inside. She couldn't understand much of what I was saying since I was hysterical, but she gathered I'd found Tyler's dead body in the woods. By the time the police arrived, they waited for me to calm down so I could explain what I saw. It was a mess, and they must have thought I was nuts. They searched in the area where I saw Tyler, but they didn't find him. They found his body yards upon yards further away from the creek. Tyler had been reclined on his knees with his forehead against the ground, immobile and dead. I refused to ID him. I just couldn't see those empty eye sockets again. When I recovered from the event, I wanted to know what happened. I emailed the pathologist who performed Tyler's autopsy and practically begged for answers. I needed a logical explanation for what I saw. He explained to me how they were going through a routine procedure when they hit a minor roadblock. When they sliced Tyler open, dead bees poured out. His body had been literally bloated with bees. His eyes were missing, his jaw broken, completely unhinged. His teeth were gone along with his tongue, which was replaced with wax. The worst part was this: his organs were gone. All that was left was a skeleton, muscles, and tissues which seemed to be the base for the extreme amounts of honeycomb within his chest cavity. The pathologist's only theory was that the bees devoured his organs. But bees aren't carnivorous. The only way that I can explain this is this. There is a scientific concept called microevolution, and it's defined as evolutionary change within a species or a small group of organisms, especially over a short period. It must have been triggered by the pesticides. It must have.